What is it? Pizza, macaroni and cheese, chicken salad, sushi? Well, we all have different food preferences, but food is a source of large molecules that are needed for life called biomolecules. There are four major biomolecules that make up all of life, and this will be the focus of this video. Before we get into details about the four biomolecules, we need to talk about one very important vocabulary word, the word monomer. A monomer is a building block. If I had some large substance, the parts that make up the substance are called monomers, just like building blocks. We're going to talk a lot about monomers today because we need to understand what the biomolecules are made of. And we need to understand biomolecules because they're building components of life. So let's introduce the four biomolecules now and talk a little bit about their functions. We'll start with carbohydrates, carbs. Well, carbs are something that you've probably heard a lot about when people are talking about diets. You know, they try to go low carb, or maybe they want a lot of carbs. Diets always come and go. Pasta and breads are examples of foods heavy in carbohydrates. Carbs are actually a very important source of energy. In fact, that's one big function of carbs. They are a great, fast source of energy. If you are a marathon runner, you might want to eat a lot of carbs the night before a race. Lots of marathon runners do this. It's called pasta loading. They eat a big pasta dinner the night before they go out on their marathon. Now, carbs have a monomer. Again, remember, monomers are building blocks. The monomer for a carb is a monosaccharide. I know that's a big mouthful, but monosaccharides make up carbohydrates. Next one up is a diverse group known as lipids. Lipids are better known as fats, and they have two different types of building blocks. One type of building block is called a fatty acid, and the other type is called a glycerol. Now, examples of lipids include butter, oil, and cholesterol. Lipids, though, they have a lot of great functions. You might think, well, that's fat. How good can fat be? Well, it just depends when you put it into context. For example, you know those really adorable seals that you see on calendars? They have this fluffy white hair. They're actually called a harp seal. Well, they only look like that when they're babies. When they get older, they're not quite as cute. In their little baby stage, they actually have a lot of this hair that they're born with that keeps them warm. But over time, they have to develop blubber. It's fat, and it helps keep them warm. Lipids are great for insulating. Also, you might not think about fats as being related to energy, but fats are a great source of long-term energy. They can store energy for a long time. Say, for example, you wanted to swim the English Channel. That's like 21 miles of swimming. The fastest swimmers might be able to do that in 7 or 8 hours, but it might take a lot longer than that for the average swimmer. More like 25 hours, and that's a lot of swimming. Well, you would want to make sure that your body has enough lipids, enough stored fat that it can pull upon. Because after you burn off those carbohydrates, remember, carbs are the fast source of energy, you might not have enough energy storage unless you have some lipids on hand. Lipids also make up cell membranes. So they are very important for life because all living things are made of cells. Of course, an excessive amount of lipids could be a bad thing for your health. Remember, it's all about moderation. Okay, next, proteins. Now, when you hear about proteins, a lot of times you might think about power bars. They say they have a lot of protein in them and that they help with muscle building. Well, protein is great for muscle building. Examples of foods that are high in protein include meats and many types of beans. The monomers of protein are amino acids. So sometimes you see these labels that say, this has 20 amino acids in this food. And really, they're just trying to say that it has protein, because proteins are made of amino acids, so that's just some fancy advertising for you. But in addition to being important for muscle development, protein is also very important for other functions, such as working in the immune system and acting as enzymes. Remember, enzymes are made of proteins, so proteins are important for the body. Now, when we start talking about genes, the DNA genes, not the genes you wear, the DNA codes for proteins that are very important for structure and function in the body. The last biomolecule is known as a nucleic acid. Nucleic acids include DNA and RNA, which we'll get to when we get to genetics. They have a monomer called a nucleotide. It's going to be an easy one for you to remember because nucleotide sounds a lot like nucleic acid. And if considering DNA and RNA, both of these are involved in genetic information for the coding of your traits. They are found in a lot of your food because whenever you eat something that came from something once living, it can still contain the DNA. For example, when you eat a strawberry, you're actually consuming all the cells that make up that strawberry. And in the nucleus of all those strawberry cells is DNA. Plants and animals both have DNA. In fact, any type of life must contain nucleic acids to direct the cell's activities. So we just powered through introducing the 4 biomolecules by providing examples, exploring their monomers, and giving some general functions. One last very important part to mention is the structure of these biomolecules. Understanding the structure can help with predicting their properties and easily being able to identify them. One thing I like to tell students to do is to write the 4 biomolecules in the same order that we went through: carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Then remember this mnemonic device that goes with these 4 biomolecules: cho, cho, chon, chomp. Instead of chomp at the end with an M, it's chomp at the end with an N. The C stands for carbon, the H stands for hydrogen, the O for oxygen. So carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids all have that CHO in there. It's just that proteins and nucleic acids also have an N, which is nitrogen. And nucleic acids additionally have a P, which is for phosphorus. So again, CHO, CHO, CHON, CHOMP, the major elements in the 4 biomolecules. Now, these elements are arranged differently in the 4 biomolecules. It's important to explore the arrangement of the elements in biomolecules because the structure of that arrangement greatly impacts the biomolecule function. So, to the Google to discover some biomolecule arrangement illustrations. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
All right, so I thought that was a great introductory video to us discussing our biological molecules, right? So we've been talking again all of last week. We talked about the elements from an elemental standpoint and their role in living things, and we advanced the conversation a little bit to talk about chemical reactions in the production of these compounds that are made, right? And so we know that chemical reactions occur in order for us to produce these larger, more complex products that we need, all right? So there are 2 types of reactions that you'll read about actually this weekend that allows for the synthesis of these biological molecules, the carbs, proteins, and lipids, and they are hydrolysis reactions and dehydration reactions. So you'll read a little bit more about those this weekend. Let's look at some, I have a few slides here. Not a whole lot, just to make sure we're all on the same page about biological molecules. I think the video pretty much said everything that I'm getting ready to say, so if you took notes, you should be fine right now. But we're clear that these biological molecules, also known as macromolecules, are the building blocks of life, right? So it's often said, so carbon, right? We've been talking about carbon. You're going to hear about carbon for an eternity. And it's often said that life is carbon-based, okay? And what that means is that carbon atoms form the fundamental components of many of the molecules that are found uniquely in living things, okay? So right at the end of that video, she gave you a rundown of the elements that are found in all of those biological molecules. And of course, one of the common links was carbon, okay? Life is carbon-based, all right? So these macromolecules that we're talking about, by definition, these macromolecules are large molecules that are necessary for life and that are built from smaller organic molecules, all right? What did she call those smaller building blocks? She gave you a term.
Monomers.
Monomers. Thank you, Kadena. Monomers. So we're going to look here today at the various monomers that are responsible for the formation of these larger macromolecules. Okay. One glucose molecule alone is a monomer, right? We know that two or more molecules linked together makes a polymer. All right. These are two terms that you should be familiar with: polymer and monomer, right? These large macromolecules by definition are examples of polymers, right? We want to identify the monomers for each one, all right? Carbohydrates. This is our first class of biological molecules. What did you grab from your video about carbohydrates? What's so important about carbs?
They give you energy.
Yeah, do we need carbs? Yeah, we absolutely need carbs for what? Energy, right? We said that carbs are our fast, easy source of energy, all right? These carbohydrates are a major food source and a key form of energy for most organisms, right? So not just humans, all right? When you get in some of your higher level courses, if you take microbiology with me, and we'll have a whole nother conversation about this requirement for growing microorganisms, okay? The elemental makeups of carbohydrates are typically going to be our carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. Write that down. All right, carbs are the most abundant biomolecule available. All right, these are some important facts about our carbohydrates as a biological molecule. Okay, they are the most abundant. They are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they are the major source of energy for most living things. All right, monomers that make up carbohydrates are our monosaccharides, right? So you've probably heard of the term simple sugars, right? An example is glucose. Okay, glucose is going to be the monomer of a lot of our complex carbohydrates that we consume. All right, and so this monomer by name is a monosaccharide. You probably have that in your notes already. There are varying types of monosaccharides. Glucose, for example, you hear a lot about glucose, right? Then you have some others, fructose and galactose. These are also examples of simple sugars or our monosaccharides. Okay, jot those down. Fructose as an example of a monosaccharide. One sugar, a simple sugar. Okay. You can see the chemical structure of these can vary, right? Glucose is a 6-carbon sugar, while fructose is a 5-carbon sugar, okay? You see fructose as a not so ideal added sugar in our foods. We see galactose also as an example of a monosaccharide, all right? We talked about bonding and linkages, chemical bond formation, right? Glycosidic linkages are those that can hold together these sugar molecules to create these more complex carbohydrates, okay? So glycosidic linkages, glycosidic bonds hold together sugar molecules. All right, an example of a complex carb that is formed is a starch. You know, we consume starch in our diets. Another type of sugar are disaccharides, right? So we can have the formation of a disaccharide when we join two monosaccharides together, right? So now we're talking about chemical reactions taking place. If you look at the prefix here, di, that prefix di means two, all right? So these are some types of carbohydrates that we consume. We have monosaccharides and we also have disaccharides, all right? I want you to be familiar with a few of these disaccharides, okay? Maltose, lactose. I know you've heard about lactose before. Sucrose, okay? Sucrose is another word for table sugar. These are all examples of disaccharides. Okay. These disaccharides are formed by joining together two monosaccharides. Maltose, lactose, sucrose. These are all examples of disaccharides. I'm not necessarily going to require you to remember the structure of these disaccharides, but I would like you to know the monomeric subunits, which maltose is made from 2 glucose units. Jot that down. Lactose is made from glucose and galactose. These are both monosaccharides right here. Lactose is made from joining glucose and galactose. And then sucrose, okay, is made from joining glucose and fructose. Jot those down. What questions do we have about this? So that's 2 sugar units. Then now we get to this conversation of our complex carbs, right? These complex carbs are made up of longer chains of sugar. So now we don't just have our 1 or 2 sugar units. We have many, many, many different chains of sugars, and we call these polysaccharides, all right? Polysaccharides. I thought I had a slide for polysaccharides. But write down the term polysaccharides. That's when you have many, many, many 2 or more sugar units present in this carb, right? Polysaccharides. And then we can look at 2 different types of carbs, okay? Cellulose. Cellulose is a unique type of starch that we don't consume, all right? We don't have the enzymatic capability to break down cellulose, so we don't consume it naturally, all right? We do consume starch, all right? So you should understand that there are different types of carbohydrates, but not all of them are edible or digestible by humans. Okay, there are structural differences that makes it a little difficult for us to digest cellulose. All right. All right. What questions do we have about carbohydrates as a class of biomolecules? All right. Let's keep going. Let's look at lipids.
Wait, I had a question.
Sure.
Sorry, I was trying to raise my hand.
Okay.
Can you explain a little bit again how we could digest starch more than we could digest cellulose, or that we cannot digest cellulose?
Yeah, the short answer is the enzyme. Our digestive, we don't have the digestive enzymes that would allow us to digest cellulose. It's not meant to be eaten for us.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Lipids. Let's look at lipids. Lipids are another important class of biological molecules. What did you guys get from the video about lipids? Share your learning about lipids.
The building blocks are made of fatty acids and glycerol.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What else? What do we know about lipids? What role do they play in our existence?
And then
They make
up
a cell
membranes.
Absolutely. Okay. Lipids are a major component of the cell membrane. That is one of the most important characteristics or properties here. We know that all cells have a cell membrane, right? We're made up of cells. Our bodies are made up of cells. Lipids are the major component in the cell membrane. What type of lipids specifically? Does anyone remember? Have we talked about that? No.
Is it phospholipids?
It's the phospholipid. I don't know how much I've talked about it yet, but I know that's chapter 4 too. So phospholipids are a special type of lipid that makes up the cell membrane. All right. So these are our fats. Okay. So lipids are a class of organic compounds that are fatty acids or some type of a derivative of a fatty acid. Okay. Typically, these molecules are insoluble in water, but they are soluble in other organic solvents. All right. So I think in our last class, we talked a little bit about how substances interact with water, and we defined the terms hydrophobic and hydrophilic. Did we? I think we did.
Yes.
Yes. So would lipids be hydrophilic or hydrophobic?
Hydrophobic.
They
Right.
would be hydrophobic. Okay, these are water insoluble. All right, so we're talking about oils, waxes, and substances that do not readily dissolve in water. All right, lipids are a class of water insoluble compounds. Okay, so lipids can either be solid or liquid. Right, you know that we have fats like lard that are solid at room temperature. Right? And then we have lipids that are liquid at room temperature, and those are going to be our oils. All right. We say that these are non-polar substances because they do not mix with water. Hydrophobic. So waxes, oils, lard, butter, all of those are examples of lipids. Okay. Now, fats often get a bad rap. We do need fats, as you know, again, for the major component of the cell membrane. And then again, in our bodies, if there is an absence of carbohydrates, what are our bodies going to go to for a source of energy? What are our bodies going to burn?
Your fats, your lipids.
It's going to burn these fats. Okay, that's what's happening on these ketogenic diets. Although they're not very safe and healthy long term, they do work a little bit to help you lose weight. And you basically deprive your body of carbohydrates, right? So you starve yourself of carbs, and it forces your body to do what? Burn fat.
Burn fat, yeah.
So in theory, it works. But from a healthy standpoint, and I don't really want to debate or step on any toes if anybody practices a ketogenic diet, is overall not safe for a long term, because a lot of people end up eating a lot of meats and foods that don't have carbs, but you burn fat, but you creating a whole bunch of other problems like arteriosclerosis and clogging your arteries and so forth, eating all these meats and things that aren't necessarily that good for you. So everything is okay in moderation, right? But the ketogenic diet does work, but it's not very healthy. All right, your body needs carbs. All right, that's my little commercial for that. Lipids that are liquid at room temperature are composed mostly of unsaturated fatty acids. So we talked about fatty acids and glycerols as the monomeric subunits for lipids. Okay, we have different types of oleic and linoleic and acids as structures in these unsaturated fatty acids that we see in vegetable oils. Not to get too far into this and too deep, but in terms of looking at nutritional labels and trying to figure out which things are good and which things aren't. When it comes to fat, you want unsaturated fats. Okay, so unsaturated fats are better for you than saturated fats. Okay. The phospholipid, this is a special type of lipid that we've talked about a little bit already, and it is the major major component in the cell membrane. All right, we know that this phospholipid molecule is sort of ambivalent or amphipathic. It has a water-loving component on the outside. Those heads are polar hydrophilic regions, and then our tails that are tucked down in the middle are hydrophobic, right? These are our non-polar hydrophobic tails that are sort of tucked into the inner layers of that lipid bilayer. We talked about the structure of the membrane being a lipid bilayer. We got those tails tucked on the inside. We got those polar heads on the outside that are interacting with water in the extracellular environment as well as intracellularly. There's also an aqueous environment in there. All right. And so structurally, this is what it looks like. We've got carbon, hydrogen, oxygens present in these phospholipids. We got this polar head, we've got this non-polar tail, and we've got this glycerol backbone. All right. So some important properties of the phospholipid is that it does have this sort of amphipathic nature. All right. Another example of a lipid are our steroids, right? These steroids are also very essential in living things. They regulate a lot of processes in our bodies. You've probably heard about cholesterol, estrogen, testosterone. There are different types of cholesterol. We need it. It's not all bad. LDL and HDL. The LDL is the good cholesterol, if I'm not mistaken. Can anybody confirm that? I'm pretty sure the LDL is the better cholesterol for your body. Women, we know we require the hormone estrogen. Men, you need testosterone for a lot of the male specific features, okay? So these steroids are important, all right? Our body makes them naturally, but we can also acquire them synthetically, okay? So real quick, we're not in the classroom, but on your paper, if you had to think about some foods or some sources of lipids, what would you tell me? Okay. And then tell me really quickly in your notebook, how are carbohydrates and lipids different from one another? Properties, the makeup, the function. Think about that for a second. See if you can answer those questions for me. Take about 2 minutes and do that. Okay. So real quick, what are some examples of foods that contains lipids? Anyone?
Peanut butter.
Avocados.
Butter, avocado, absolutely, absolutely. Thank
Fish.
you. Anything with fats. How are carbs and lipids different from one another?
Lipid. Oh.
Mm-hmm. So let the gentleman speak, Kadena. Thank you.
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah, basically as we were saying earlier, how it could be soluble or insoluble in water.
Absolutely.
And,
So carbs are
mixed
typically
with-
water soluble. Absolutely. And lipids are water insoluble. Those are great characteristics. Thank you, Jalen. What else? The structure of them, you think about their functions and so forth. All right, let me keep going because we're actually really close to our time today. Let's look at proteins real quick. All right, proteins are another important biological molecule. All right, the monomer for proteins are amino acids. Right, so amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Right, this structure right here represents an amino acid, and we'll come back. We do have another unit where we'll look at transcription and translation and the production of proteins, and we'll talk a little bit more about this amino acid structure. All right, but we got this amino group over here, we got a carboxyl group here, we have these R side chains, and these are responsible for the different properties of our amino acids, this R group. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about that in another chapter. All right, but proteins, absolutely essential. All right, they're held together. The amino acids that make up a protein, the building blocks of proteins are amino acids. These amino acids are held together by a peptide bond. Write that down. Peptide bonds hold together adjoining amino acids to create proteins, okay? Proteins are basically just these linear assemblages of amino acids, okay? The scientific term for many monomers linked together are polymers. All right, so the polymer in this case is the protein. The building block are the amino acids. Okay, we join amino acids together via a peptide bond. So when these amino acids join together, the protein itself, once the protein is made, they can arrange in different structures. Okay, so there are 4 different levels of protein structure. Jot these down really quickly. 4 levels of protein structure. All right, primary structure, secondary structure, tertiary structure, and quaternary structure. The primary structure of the protein is basically the linear sequence of amino acids. So this is just all of the amino acids that make up this particular protein. Okay, every protein has a specific arrangement of amino acids present. Okay, the secondary structure of a protein is when you have interactions between adjacent amino acids. So we've got a couple of peptide chains, and the secondary structure happens when adjacent amino acids interact. Okay, an example of a secondary structure is an alpha helix or a beta sheet. Like, and it's basically like folding, right? These proteins can fold into, you know, various arrangements or interact with adjacent amino acids. And then that tertiary structure refers to the actual folding and conformational changes in that polypeptide chain. Okay, so the tertiary structure is a 3D folding of a polypeptide chain. So again, that's a new word for you. Polypeptide is another word for a protein. Protein is sort of like our end product, right? After it's probably gone some kind of modifications and changes and things like that. But a polypeptide is simply a chain of amino acids that is on its way to becoming a protein. So we do sometimes use those terms interchangeably. So tertiary structure of the protein, 3D folding of that polypeptide chain, all right? This represents some tertiary folding here, okay? We refer to these foldings or changes in structure as conformation. You may hear the term conformation, or when you read this weekend, you may see the term conformation. That's another word for like structure, if you will, all right? And then we have this, the 4th level is quaternary structure, okay? Quaternary structure is an arrangement of multiple polypeptide chains interacting together, okay? So the quaternary structure here, now we have 2 or more polypeptide chains arranging itself into some conformation for a functional protein product. Now I'm gonna keep pushing here because we're gonna run out of time, but this is being recorded and I will upload it. Did I press record? Okay. So let's look at some examples of some proteins. So examples, keratin. Keratin plays a role as a structural protein, all right? You've probably heard about it as a structural protein for our hair, skin, nails, all right? Actin and myosin fibers are in our muscle cells. These are also examples of structural proteins, all right? So we have different types of proteins that have various functions. So we got structural proteins, we've got some other proteins that function as hormones, right? So these are some classes of proteins. So we got structural proteins and we have hormones, right? An example of a hormone here is insulin, all right? Insulin is a hormone that is responsible for regulating our blood sugar, okay? People with diabetes have malfunctions in their insulin production or use, all right? And they may have to receive insulin injections, all right? Enzymes are another class of proteins. Write this down. Enzymes are proteins that are specifically involved in speeding up the rate of chemical reactions. We'll talk about enzymes a little bit more in another chapter. Transport proteins. All right, we talked about transport at the level of the cell membrane, I think. Maybe we have, maybe we haven't. But transport, all right? So some proteins are structured to transport substances throughout our bodies. So for example, hemoglobin is an example of a transport protein. It's responsible for carrying oxygen in our blood, all right? Hemoglobin. The structure of proteins can be changed by a number of factors, okay? Heat, acidity, other chemicals can all change the structure of proteins, and that's due to a process known as denaturation. Write this term down, denature. Denaturing a protein changes its shape. And real quick, changing the shape of the protein would do what to the protein? Just if you had to take a guess. From a
Will that
chemical,
alter
it will alter what, Jalen?
the not its texture, it's what it's called, its build? I can't think of
Well, the
the exact
structure,
word.
right? So when we denature it, we're changing the shape. And so if we change the shape of it, then we ultimately will affect what? There's a close relationship between structure and
Bond? The bond for it? I'm about to say the makeup of it, I don't know.
so the structure kind of relates to the makeup of it, but I'm thinking about the word function. Write this down. In science, there's a strong relationship between structure and function. So if you alter the structure of this protein, remember we just went through those 4 levels of structure: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. If we alter those structures at all, at some point we're going to affect the function of that protein, because in order to end up with our final functioning protein product, we have to have it in its ideal conformation or structure. So if we alter that structure, we're going to alter our product a little bit. Okay, so like when you fry an egg, you're adding this heat. Heat is an example of a denaturing agent. It's going to change the structure of that protein. Okay. So real quick, this is the point that I think I was just making. The shape of the protein determines its function. Okay, so we have our amino acids, right, which are our building blocks of our proteins, and then these amino acids can assemble themselves in various structures. So we have our secondary structures, the alpha helices and so forth. We got those 3D quaternary structures, and then we have quaternary structures where we have multiple polypeptide chains interacting together for a final functioning product for this protein. Well, if we change that, we can ultimately affect the function of that protein. Okay. I got 3 minutes. Nucleic acids. This is our last class of biological molecules. All right. Nucleic acids are absolutely essential for the transmission of information, the genetic information. All right. The monomers for nucleic acids are nucleotides. All right. There are 2 types of nucleic acids, right? DNA and RNA. The building blocks are nucleotides. Write this term down, nucleotide. Okay. Nucleotides join together to form nucleic acids. All right. The structure of a nucleotide is that there is a sugar group, a phosphate group, and a nitrogenous base. You've probably heard this information before. All right. So these nucleic acids are responsible for, again, transmission of genetic information and the production of our proteins. All right. So DNA, real quick, structurally is a little bit different than RNA. DNA is a double-stranded or 2-stranded molecule, right? So what we have are 2 strands of nucleotides, right, which are our building blocks. So we have a strand of nucleotides here, and then we have another strand of nucleotides here. And so we essentially get this double-stranded molecule that we refer to as a double helix, where we have 2 strands of nucleotides that sort of wind around each other in this kind of a spiral formation. Okay. There are hydrogen bonds present in our DNA molecule. All right. So again, we're tying in all of these concepts that we've been talking about: chemical elements, chemical bond formation. There are hydrogen bonds holding this DNA molecule together. Okay. There's another type of bond called a phosphodiester bond that we'll get to in another unit. All right. Adenosine triphosphate, this ATP, is very important for us acquiring energy. I'm going to stop right here. This chart is something that you should be able to fill out from memory at the end of this lesson. If I gave you the monomer for these biological molecules that we've been talking about, can you tell me the polymer that is made, right? Can you give me examples of these biological molecules? You should be able to do that. Okay. Real quick, you can snap a picture of this if you would like, so that you can start studying for your exam. I know I pushed through these last few slides, but I am recording this lecture, so you can go back and synthesize the information a little bit on your own. So we're in chapter 3 in your OER textbook. This weekend, I would like for you to move through chapter 3 with some annotations. You start on page 79. I will go through and I will probably assign more homework on Monday from this, but right now I just want you to kind of go in and read through some of the things that we talked about today and update your notes as you see